Today I'm going to walk you through prepping your fabric and cutting your fabric for your quilt. So I am using the ponder pattern from Quilting Tia. So just a lot of the information I'm going to be giving you in this video is going to pertain to this pattern. However, I'm going to try and give some tips on prepping and cutting that will be easily transferred to any pattern that you are using. So to get started, whenever I am putting together a new quilt, I really like to starch and press the fabric that I'm going to be using when piecing the top of the quilt. So I've already purchased the backing fabric for this quilt and the binding. I'm going to set those to the side and not prep them yet until I get to that part of the quilt. So in this video, I'm going to be taking the 5 yards of fabric I purchased. So you may have seen me shop for this fabric in part 1 of the series. So I have these 5 yards. What I'm going to do is, so I'm going to be spraying all of this yardage with the flatter spray. It's kind of a starch, and there are a lot of different options out there for starching fabric. You can find some starch in the laundry aisle at Walmart. It's in a can. That works really well as well. There's the flatter spray. There's Best Press. There are a lot of options out there. It just really depends on what you like to use. You also don't have to starch at all. The reason I like to starch my fabric is that I find that it helps the fabric get pressed really well. It has a little bit of a stiffness to it after using a starch and pressing. That makes it a lot easier for me to cut accurately and sew accurately. I also see that if I have any cuts that are along a bias edge, that they don't stretch as much and I get a lot more of an accurate seam, and overall my blocks turn out a lot nicer. Now, there are a lot of people who don't like to use starch, and that is fine. It isn't necessary. It's just something that I tend to do. Now, here's how I prep my fabric and press it. So I have all of my yardage here, and what I do is I take one of them and I lay it out on my table. I usually try to always spray the back of my fabric. It isn't necessary to do it that way. It is just something that I tend to always do. So I will lay it out, and then I just mist the spray across it. So once I get a nice layer of the flatter spray on it, I'll take the next fabric, lay it out, and do the same thing. So I go ahead and get all of my fabric sprayed at the same time. All right, so now I have all 5 yards of my fabric sprayed and ready to press. Now what I do is I will flip this over, and now my fabric that I sprayed first is on top. And then I'll know that this fabric has had the spray on the longest and is probably getting the driest compared to the rest of them. And I can go ahead and start pressing it. Okay, so I have a few different options that I can use for pressing my fabric. I have a cordless iron that I can use, and then I have a corded iron that I can use. And I also have my Cricut Easy Press. I really like using my Easy Press because it presses a bigger area of fabric at one time, and it really makes a quick go of pressing yardage, especially if I have a lot to press at one time. So I usually set my Easy Press to 325 degrees, and I press in one area for only about 10 seconds and then move around the fabric. Now, my favorite iron to use in my sewing space is this cordless Panasonic. It is very small and lightweight. I like to use it for pressing, seams, and it ends up where my wrist doesn't hurt at the end of the day, or my forearm, because it's so lightweight. However, it doesn't stay heated really well. when I'm using it to press a lot of yardage. The heat dies away pretty quickly. My other corded iron, the Rowento, works really well for this as well. It just, because I have the easy press for other things that I like to work on, it's just nicer for me to be able to get this big area pressed really, really quickly. All right, so get all of your fabric nice and pressed, get all those creases out, and then we'll talk about cutting. All right, so now that all of my fabric is pressed, it is time to start cutting it. Whenever I am cutting fabric for a pattern, I almost always get it ready in the same way. I fold my fabric so that the selvage edges are together. So you can see the selvage edge is the edge that often has all of the information about the fabric across it. And then I line up the fold of the fabric with a line on my cutting mat. The next thing I do is I square up one side of the fabric, and that just means that I cut off that rough edge that isn't quite straight. So to do that, I line up my ruler with one of the lines that is closest to that rough edge of fabric, and I trim it off. So here you could also trim off the selvage edge of your fabric if you want. I'm going to leave it on for now just because it's such a long cut of fabric. I'm not going to be able to cut it off very straight. So now for this particular cut of fabric, I have strips that the pattern is asking me to cut from it. Now, a lot of times on a pattern, you'll see that it'll have you cut strips, and then it will tell you to subcut those strips. So I'm going to show you what that means now. So for my pattern, it is asking me to cut 3 particular widths of fabric. Now, because this cut of fabric is so wide that I can't just extend my ruler all the way across the fabric, something I can do is use more than one ruler so that I know I'm staying straight. So I'm going to add a couple rulers here. So that didn't quite extend all the way across, so I grabbed another ruler, and this will just help me make sure I'm keeping everything lined up so that I get a nice, perfect cut. So as I cut my first strip, I'm going to cut across, and when I get up to that next ruler, I need to make sure that I move my hand there so that it doesn't shift. All right. So now I'm going to cut my second strip, and to do that, I can use this other cut line as a guide, or I can move the cut strip to the side. Now, if you move the cut strip to the side, just know that it might shift a little bit. So when you go and do those subcuts later, you may want to make sure it's lined up nice and even. All right, so I'm going to line up my ruler again to get my next cut. Because remember, per my pattern, I need 3 strips from this fabric. Now, on your pattern, it may ask you to cut strips, but maybe they are not all the same width. So make sure that you are taking note of what type of fabric strips you are cutting, what size fabric strips you are cutting. Okay, this time I'm going to use that same line as before because I don't want to have to move my fabric to the side. All right, so I have all my strips cut, and I do have some extra fabric left over. So this fabric I can use in a different pattern. I can put in my scrap pile, but I definitely don't want to throw this nice big cut of fabric away. So now I have all of these strips. So what am I going to do with them? Well, sometimes in a pattern, this may be what you need to use. Maybe it's a nice wide border strip or something else. But in this particular pattern, I'm going to be cutting these strips down into squares. So I'm going to just take one of them to show you how I'm going to do this. I'm fairly confident that I didn't shift this fabric any, so I'm not going to open it up. I'm just going to go ahead and cut my squares from it just as it is, because then I'll be cutting 2 squares at a time. It'll make a little bit quicker go of it. I'm actually going to move this so that you can see it a little bit better. So I'm lining one of the edges of my strip along a line on my cutting mat, and then I'm going to trim off that salvage end because I don't want to use it in my pattern. So now I have a nice straight cut there. And this particular ruler I'm using is not wide enough to cut my next strip. So I'm going to grab another ruler I have that will make a little bit easier job of cutting my squares. And your pattern will tell you how many times you need to do this. So now I have 2 squares for this pattern, but I'm going to need 12. So I'm definitely going to have to cut this a few more times. So here, this piece of fabric is not large enough for me to cut anything for this pattern from, so I'm going to put it with that other piece of fabric that I had to use in another project. So now I have 4 of the squares I need for this pattern. Now I have my other fabric here, my other strips, and I'm going to cut the rest of my squares from it because I know that since I have 4 of these cut already, that I'm going to need to cut 8 more. So the first thing I'm going to do, again, is trim off that salvage end and then cut all of my squares. After you've finished cutting all of your fabric from one print of fabric, you can go ahead and set that to the side and cut the rest of the fabric per the pattern. However, before I move on and cut all of my fabric, I want to show you something you might encounter in a pattern. So I have a strip of fabric here. So this strip of fabric is cut to 4.5 inches. And then I'm going to cut it into 4.5-inch squares. So this isn't in the pattern that I have, but I just want to show you. So let's pretend it had me cut it into 4.5-inch squares. So it told me to subcut it into 4.5-inch squares, and then maybe the pattern will say to cut it once along the diagonal. So that just means you're going to cut it from corner to corner to make some triangles. So there we have some triangles that you might be using in your pattern, or it might ask you to cut it on the diagonal twice. So if it has you cut it along the diagonal twice, it means you're going to cut it from corner to corner once, and then you're going to cut it again corner to corner going in the other direction. So now you've ended up with a bunch of triangles. So that's another thing you might encounter in your pattern depending on what you need, what cuts you need to complete your pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of my fabric cut per my pattern. All right, so for my pattern, this is what all of my cut fabric looks like. So I have that large scale print, medium, and then I have my light, my medium, and my dark fabric all cut. These long strips here are all for border pieces, and then all of my pieces here are to piece all the blocks together per my pattern. Now, one thing your pattern might have in it, mine does not, but one thing that a lot of patterns have is they'll label all the pieces as you cut them. A lot of times they'll use letters. So maybe this large block in the pattern might be labeled as F. Then if your if your pattern has that aspect to it, it is really nice to be able to label them all, so when you piece blocks together, you can easily see what fabric piece that they're using in a block as you sew it together. Now, these little squares that I have, they are called alphabetties, and you can buy them at your local quilt shop or online, and they're really nice for just placing on pieces. You can also make your own marking pins really easily. So like I said, if this was labeled F, you could just take a pin that you've put a bead on, and now you know that this stack of fabric is labeled F and can easily refer to it in the pattern. I have a video showing how to make these that I'll link to, and I'll also link to some alphabetties if you think you would like to use those better. Now, if your pattern doesn't have any of your fabric labeled and a lot of your cuts are really close in size, something else you can do is in your pattern, just label them yourself. Write A next to one of the cuts, and then you'll know that that's what you're using as you build your quilt together. All right, so all of my pieces are cut. One other thing I want to show you though is at some point when we're cutting, we may miscut something. It happens. If you don't want to go back to the store and find some more fabric, there are a few things you can do. Remember, with this green, I had quite a bit left over as I was cutting. So something you could do is just use some of that extra fabric and sew it together so that you can expand your fabric that you have left over a little bit bigger to get the right block size. So you can see with this one, I just pieced it together. Once it's in the quilt, you likely won't notice. So let me show you a quilt that I made quite a long time ago. There is a seam here on this block. Now on this one, I was able to finagle it a little bit so that it matched the seam going here. But technically on this quilt, let me find the other block like that. Technically on that quilt, on this quilt, all those other triangles should be one solid piece. Once you have it all in the quilt and have everything sewn all together and quilted, a lot of the times you won't notice that if you have to piece some fabric together. Now this is a big focal block, so it might be a little more noticeable than say some of these smaller blocks. So hopefully you don't miscut on something like that. But you can also try and piece it together. I didn't get it perfect, but you can see I matched the pattern pretty closely. Now that would make it a little less noticeable if you are able to do that, if you do miscut something. Now, hopefully you won't, but that is one idea for kind of making it work without having to run back to the fabric shop if you don't have enough fabric to get that cut that you need. Okay, so now that all of the pieces are cut for my quilt, in the next video, I will be showing you how to piece blocks together for a pattern. So I'll see you then. Bye.